This is an interview with Dr. Leonard Barkan, a scholar of early modern European culture whose work bridges literature, art history, and the classics. He earned degrees from Swarthmore, Harvard, and Yale, taught across institutions including UC San Diego, Northwestern, Michigan, NYU, and Princeton, and is the author of books like Berlin for Jews and Michelangelo, A Life on Paper, exploring how language, images, and the past speak to the present. You can read more about Dr. Barkan on our website, 6degrees.blog, and our Instagram page, 6degreesaway. Thank you and enjoyed the interview.
You earned your bachelor's at Swarthmore, an MA at Harvard, and a PhD at Yale. How did these experiences and mentors shape your early interest in literature, art, and classical studies? Were there particular professors or moments that set your research course?
Absolutely. I had a really, almost I'd say through no special excellence of my own, but I had a wonderful education. I mean, beginning with Horace Mann of the private high school in New York, and in a way that may be the most important link in this whole chain. And then I found myself in sort of the money load of kind of uh, cultural studies of all kinds. And, the thread was literature and languages. I was always pretty good at languages. A little bit, I heard foreign languages in the house. Um, uh, I always lived in New York. And, and then I went to a really extraordinarily wonderful high school, private school called Horace Mann. And in a way, I think that was the beginning. And then I just found found for myself, not necessarily knowing that I was doing it, what can I say, sort of the royal road of studying the humanities, and especially studying European culture quite a few centuries ago. Sometimes many said, antiquity, mostly the Renaissance or the early modern period, sort of 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. And this is always a project in humanistic studies in multiple languages, mostly literature. Then the circumstances of my becoming an art historian, in which I always say the first time I was in an art history class, I was the professor. I just kept going from one, any particular cultural subject would always seem to have a cultural subject next to it that I needed, that I wanted as a kind of adjunct, whether I knew how to do it or not. And that meant learning another language, learning a lot of history, and all of this was kind of essentially what the humanities wants to be, which is sort of sharing past culture and re-experiencing it in the present moment. And quite early on, I realized that a long time ago, I was interested in things that happened a long time ago, not things that happened a year ago or even a decade ago or even a century ago. And I always tell this story about a wonderful professor of mine at Swarthmore, who eventually became a colleague at Princeton, who spent two classes on an eight-line medieval poem. And that kind of the realization that kind of density of past culture and the overcoming the challenge of its alienness, it seemed to be a tremendous prize at the end of saying I'm in touch with this 15th century voice. And of course, I'm not really, I can't, ask it out for a cup of coffee. But that I was stepping outside my own moment. And that seemed like a great adventure. And it continues to.
Mm. What languages were you hearing inside your house, and what languages do you speak now?
Um, I heard English, obviously. I heard Yiddish, which sort of, Yiddish is basically German, of a particular historical moment. And there's also a whole sort of French dimension of family connections because of people who had managed to get out of France, Jews who managed to get out and stayed not exactly with us, but in we knew them, and so it was and my parents spoke Yiddish. They came to America as small children. They spoke English without an accent. They were totally New York people, but they spoke Yiddish, and that must have been the beginning of. And I was good at languages. That was just I don't know why exactly. I picked them up quickly. I liked grammar and those things. So I speak French, German, and Italian, and I would say in order: Italian best, German second best, French third. Although that's the earliest and the easiest of them. The thing about French is I don't use it very much, whereas Italian I use all the time because of my work, and German we actually spend summers in Berlin, so where everybody speaks English, which I think is a little sad. But I use those three languages. I can read Latin, not as well as I should, but language was the heart of this project, I think, for me, until art became the heart of the project. But that came a little later.
Before Princeton, you taught at UC San Diego, Northwestern, Michigan, and NYU. How did working in such diverse academic settings influence your scholarly perspective and approach to comparative literature?
Well, that's a rich and complicated question. um, uh, in a certain sense, I mean, what really differs in that sequence of stages is not the intellectual. I mean, that's very common there. I mean, here I was at institutions, all of which were sort of A-level institutions, where I mean the public, they were institutions that were very selective about their students. I mean, to a greater or lesser degree, obviously, Princeton as an extreme instance of it. It's what I was doing didn't have a special UC San Diego quality and then a Michigan quality. I think life was different, and the sort of what it meant to teach, what the sort of social aspect of work with students and colleagues that could have varied. But I mean, I always came to these places, as an expert in a certain set of cultural matters, kind of early modern culture, literature, and art. And I would say I sort of delivered. I delivered my product in a way. I don't know that. I mean, the social experience and experience of colleagueship was very different among those institutions. And I have a lot of friends from my, say my cohort at Yale Graduate School, where I got my PhD. Quite a few of whom have, went off to teach at 1971 or whenever we were going, and are still there at that place. I was, for all those, I mean, until 25 years ago, I was a single person. I could pick up and move, except for the dog, which was always a problem. But, I could go somewhere else if they were interested, and it was always flattering to be offered a job, or to be sort of courted. And I loved different cultures. I mean, meanwhile, I was spending a lot of time in Italy, a lot of before that in England, and after that now in Berlin. So I was living a very sort of polycultural life, at work and in terms of where I planted myself.
Hmm. So I spoke to you about Harvey Letterman, who is a tenured professor of philosophy at Princeton, and he was saying that since at Princeton, all of his colleagues and your colleagues were so sort of tight, they were like titans in the field. They were off doing their own thing, and they had very well sort of concrete ideas. So any half-baked, something new, they weren't very open to. Did you feel anything like that, or not? Not so much.
Philosophers are very scary crowd, in my opinion. I mean, no, is the short answer to your question. I mean, um, uh, I don't know. It's interesting that he has that experience. Uh, uh, no, I think there was a period uh, in relatively early in my career, let's say at UC San Diego and at Northwestern, there were certainly kind of intellectual fashions coming and going, and I was always a little bit behind, or even very much behind. Um, and that meant that I either was miserable about that, or I tried to get, or I decided I didn't need them. I didn't need to be practicing the latest thing. Uh, I think I developed a lot, but I never became a an avant-garde sort of thinker. Or as far as sort of the reception by one's colleagues, I think there were over this my career. My first time I set foot in a college classroom as the teacher was 1971. So it really is 50 years of teaching, basically, because I retired a couple of years ago. Let's call it 2021. Um, I mean that there was a period of in say the fields of literature and the other humanities, uh, a great deal of change, and therefore a lot of tension about whether one had changed enough for one's colleagues. And certainly, my first job in San Diego, one of the things I only stayed for 3 years. There was, I mean, I think I actually undervalued how much it did for me, but at the time, I had sort of wanted to get out as fast as possible. And part of it was I didn't love San Diego. I mean, it's not a real city. So I loved I mean, I went to Los Angeles as often as I'm a city boy. But it was also very, avant-garde intellectually, and that just wasn't my thing. Uh, but I think the idea that one's colleagues look down on one because they're, for one reason or another, yes, that happens a lot. I found that much less true at Princeton, um, and that partly is maybe partly is because it was by the time I got to Princeton, there wasn't quite as much ferment going on intellectually. Well, there is now in a way, but I think also disciplines are different. I think philosophers really like to argue with each other. Even, I mean, literary scholars and art historians do, but not as much as philosophers. But certainly, I spent times especially in San Diego, but also at Northwestern, where yeah, I was getting explicitly or not explicitly a sense that my colleagues, didn't think what I was doing was sufficiently up to date or something like that.
Mhm. What draws you to Berlin?
Um, we went. Well, as I say, I know German.
Mhm.
I studied it, oddly enough, at a very early age, which meant also learning German at not that huge a distance from the Second World War. I mean, Horace Mann, which is definitely my school, definitely more responsible for who I am than any of these other institutions in the nature of, being 14 years old instead of 44 years old. Horace Mann was 90% Jewish students, including me. And I don't know why I decided I wanted to learn German. I've written about this, and said, I say in one of my books, I reached German in puberty around the same time, and my parents were horrified by both. Um, um, I wanted to learn German. Who knows why? Uh, I mean, I heard Yiddish at home, but I'm not sure I even knew. I mean, it was an incredible leg up on learning German because they're basically the same language with, sort of a little bit of vocabulary from Hebrew. Um, uh, uh, but, I did want to learn German. And I then at a certain point, we went, I was invited, and this is now 15 years ago. I'm not in childhood anymore. I was invited to the American Academy in Berlin for a semester, and we ended up staying a year. We sort of fell in love with Berlin, and I wrote a book called Berlin for Jews about why Berlin feels at very much a home to me, not in spite of the Jewish question, but because it was a city. Not unlike New York, where at a certain point, and then not, but at a certain point, Jews contributed enormously to the culture of the city. So I wrote a book called Berlin for Jews, which was sort of a kind of semi-travel book saying, this is, if you like New York, you'll love Berlin. It's a enormously affected by 100 good years before the 30 very bad years of Jewish culture.
Your appointments span comparative literature, art and archaeology, classics, and English. How have those interdisciplinary roles shaped your methodology, and how do literary criticism and art history complement each other in your work?
Um, Good. That's a good. All your questions are very good. Um, I, at a certain point, I mean, I knew from Swarthmore, from undergraduate time, as I started contemplating graduate school and therefore an academic career, I knew that that there was a kind of magnetism for me in the past, that I wasn't going to be someone whose principal work was on the culture of his own time or even recent centuries. And and my attachment to the Renaissance, which now that term is a little bit unfashionable, we call it early modern, whatever you call it. My attachment, was because there was Shakespeare and there was Michelangelo, and I mean, what more do you? What other reasons do you need? That it was the best stuff, and that's why I found it attractive. The other side of that, or an additional side of that, is that I always studied what I wanted to study. I didn't. I mean, I was fortunate because I mean, it's really going from Swarthmore to Yale. Although I did go to Harvard in between, and I didn't like it, so I left and went to Yale. But I was delivered into a certain kind of highly intellectual, cultural, historical mindset, language set, thinking set, and I was the one then who said, well, I don't want to stick only with literature, even though that's what my credential was, always literature. And I felt somehow whatever topic I addressed, first of all, I loved the fact that it was a long time ago, that culture was different, that I was visiting another planet to be looking at the 16th century. And that was an enormous part of the fun of it, was, making friends from another century. And secondly, also in othering, also that it was in all sorts of cultural ways, different from me. Um, and that sort of business of liking what's different, I think, has had a lot to do with what I do, but also a sense that the compartments of study have to be challenged. I mean, I realized at a certain point uh, uh, when I sort of writing my PhD dissertation, I think it's most came home to me that the things that interested me most about literature had enormous overlap to art history, um, in which I had never taken a course, but they just did, and it's not that anybody who doesn't do art history and only does literature is somehow necessarily missing anything. But what I was interested in over and over again was, you needed both of them. The way you needed more than one language, you needed more than one discipline. And, I always thought in a way, the foundational work in art history is Vasari's Lives of the Artists, which was written in the late 15th, early 16th century, basically in Florence. And I spent a summer in Chicago, I remember, in my apartment, sitting in one particular chair in front of a window, reading Vasari's 9 volumes, reading it in Italian from cover to cover, and just loving. And Vasari is very, it doesn't look like art history looks now, and it looks kind of naive in a lot of ways, but it was, he saw everything, he described everything, and he told wonderful stories about everything. So it was, I was in that business of, what's a good story? It's not an accident that I've done a lot of theater also in my life, including recently, now again, after many years of not doing it. The sort of performance as a system is very attractive to me. And and then there's Shakespeare and Michelangelo, each of whom I've written at least one book about. So it's also the magnetism of the extreme geniuses, the geniuses beyond what you can imagine. And I'm sort of a snob. I have again and again written about the really great, the greatest of all. Not what I'm doing right now, interestingly. The book I'm currently, it's in just after the war was over in Europe, sort of literally days after the war was over in Europe, a collection of paintings, which was the Berlin Gallery collection, which were being kept because of the bombing. They were not. It was too late. They had trucked art outside of the city to the salt mines in Silesia. It was getting too late to do that because the art was in more danger from transport than it would be. So they put it in the basement of anti-aircraft towers, which were safe from bombing, but not safe from fire. So, and this is the key point, after the war was over, about 430 old master paintings were burnt up by accident in the basement of the anti-aircraft tower. And I'm writing a book about those paintings and bringing them back, making the world aware of what they were. And that means some of them are very famous painters like Caravaggio, and some of them are not. And it's very important in this book to have a sort of democratic principle. Every painting, no painting deserved to be burnt up. No painting was so bad that it was okay that it was burnt up. And that's so. But that sense, the sense of the distant past, and a kind of snobbery about my obsession with Well, with Shakespeare, Michelangelo, and Mozart, and that's those are my guys.
Hmm. So in Michelangelo, A Life on Paper, you examine his habit of writing notes on sketches. What led you to explore text and image interplay in his work, and what new insights about his creative process emerged?
Um, uh, it starts, I guess, with my kind of bifurcated interest between words and images. Um, and I always loved Michelangelo and wanted to know more about him. I've spent a lot of time in Italy in my life. I speak Italian better than I speak any other foreign language. Um, um, and so Michelangelo was a vast figure in my sense of what what the Italian Renaissance meant. Um, Meanwhile, because I was interested in both words and images, it was logical to become interested in the relation between words and images, rather than keeping them, writing a book about poems and then a book about paintings. Though now I am writing a book about paintings that isn't really about poems at all. Um, but that so that over the sort of interplay became very important to me, and the idea that those were two disciplines with different disciplinary requirements, and that one of them I had been trained extensively in, and the other one I had to make it up as I went along because I never had a class in art history. Um, I think getting closer to the question of Michelangelo, um, I realized that looking at his drawings, that they nearly always had writing on them. And the writing could be the equivalent of a laundry list, or it could be a marvelous poem because he was also a poet, or anything in between. And then it's just a question, as many projects are, as my current project is, sort of saying, here's a topic that looks very interesting and nobody has asked it. I'm asking questions that nobody has asked. Um, and so, I spent several years and traveled a lot because you couldn't really talk about this if you didn't actually hold the papers in your hand because they're not that easy to decipher. So I went with my husband and to collections in Florence, in Paris, in Rome, uh, London, where there were collections of his drawings. And there exist about 600 drawings by Michelangelo exist in the world, uh, more than half of which also have handwriting on it. And it was the encounter saying nobody cared much about that. That is to say, uh, art historians cared about it if it told them something directly about the art. Uh, and literary people, people, certainly he was a poet, a very good one, but the stuff, and sometimes what's written on the pages is poetry, but it didn't catch anybody's attention. And the idea that this piece of paper, that at some point, and sometimes you can tell that he worked on them at 20-year intervals. On the same sheet of paper. They're not all planned. And paper was expensive. You would reuse paper if possible, but that the form, the fact of a piece of paper which has things on it, and of course none of these, or very few of them, intended as sort of art that he could sell, or it's his inner life, and so it seemed to be a key. So much of this, both the sketches and the writing, were written for to himself. So it was a kind of Michelangelo's unconscious in a sense, and it tells us a lot about him, as well as about his process of making art or poetry, because he wrote a lot of poetry, very interesting poetry.
Mhm. In your work, Mute Poetry, Speaking Pictures investigates relations between visual art and literature. What inspired you to look at art history through a literary lens and vice versa? And how does how does this reflect your long-standing interest in word and image, which we obviously spoke about?
Um, well, it seemed as though, and it's much less true now than it was 30 years ago when I started doing this, more than 30. It seemed as though people, did either the one or the other. And that whether it's about Michelangelo or there are many other cultural subjects where there are words and there are images and they have some relation. And so that, professionally, it was the easiest thing to say was that you would look at Michelangelo, read the very best art historical accounts of Michelangelo's drawings, and there will be, 2 square inches on a sheet of paper that have some sketch in it, and a great deal of writing around it. And an art historian simply doesn't look at the writing. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but it seemed to me crucial to look at the whole thing. I mean, all of these sheets of paper, uh, put it the other way, none of them was meant to be a finished work of art that he would sell to someone. He mostly didn't do art on paper. I mean, finished art. He was a sculptor and a painter, neither of which is deliverable on a sheet of paper. I mean, painting could be, but it generally wasn't if it was serious painting. So there was a field. You begin by saying, this looks interesting to me, and nobody seems to be talking about it. I'm sure it's not true that there's a lot of scholarship on Michelangelo. I'm not the only person to have noticed this, but generally speaking, this is interesting to me, but nobody's talking very much about it. So what happens if I start thinking about it with my training, that produces a sense of, well, asking, what do these things have to do with each other? And in this case, they are sort of sketch pages. It's not as though he's creating a work of art that has words and images in it. He's writing, he's writing out what's in his head with words and images. So for me, that means even better. It's even closer to whatever his genius is than looking, at the David all the time. A great finished work. That's wonderful. But this was, as I say in the book, it's like, it's a little bit like unearthing Michelangelo's what Freudians would call unconscious, that which we have that we don't know we have in our mind and heart.
Mhm. You've written on food and culture, including the Jerome Lectures on Renaissance cuisine and Reading for the Food. How do tangible subjects like cuisine and wine become fruitful topics for humanities scholarship?
Uh, Good, I got that one. Well, first of all, they are cultural matters of great importance, um, uh, per se. I mean, in itself. That is to say, we spend a lot of our time eating, and a lot of our social time eating with other people, and the history of that, how that is done, and with in what spaces it's done, what was actually eaten, where they fetched the food, what they said about the food, and so on. And you have cultures like ancient Rome that were foodie obsessed, and where there's many poems about food. Um, so you have this humanistic cultural medium that doesn't have the prestige of painting and poetry, but is at the center of cultural activity, including obviously what brings people together and what they do when they're together, and very often becomes a part of the high culture, which is food is not supposed to be high culture, but high culture there are, I've forgotten the number now, but 60 meals in Homer, or 80 uh, this is, again, you sort of say, well, I think this is interesting, and I'm not the only person in the universe who thinks it's interesting, but it's certainly not, no, but I gave the Jerome lectures at the American Academy in Rome, 15 or so years ago. And before you give the Jerome lectures, you're sent a list of all the last 10 or 15 years of Jerome lectures. And there wasn't any food on them. It was either very high level questions like religion, or else very mechanical things like plumbing. I mean, there literally was one set of lectures about plumbing. Food is quite connected to plumbing, it turns out. But I was looking at a very rarefied, into kind of aesthetic list of topics. And I mean, I was already thinking about writing about food, but I thought I want to make my way into this very distinguished, there's 40 or 50 years of these, not quite every year, but many, going back really to the early 20th century, I believe. And the most recent one had been something like plumbing. I don't think it was plumbing, but I say it's plumbing. And say, the hell with that. I want to think about something of a different order that doesn't have, it's not the same kind of mechanism for a culture, except it is a very important mechanism for culture. But it wasn't going to be art and music; it was going to be dinner, and which is also an aesthetic experience, in my opinion. And that sort of then it became. The book was eventually called. It wasn't called Reading for the Food. The first chapter was called Reading for the Food. The book was called The Hungry Eye. That's what it was called. Eating, Drinking, and Culture, and from Rome to the Renaissance. And that because I wasn't alone in understanding eating and drinking as high cultural subjects, but I wasn't. But there wasn't everybody. It wasn't part of the automatic expectation.
Mhm. So I quite like New York City, and a large reason why is because of the food there. So what would you say is your favorite restaurant in New York, sort of going aside from the internet?
Ooh, a lot of them, have ceased to exist. Favorite places. Um, it would be better to give a kind of. Part of the issue is that if you spend a gigantic amount of money, you can still get a bad meal, but you can get a great meal. And when we just don't spend gigantic. I guess it's a question about really in the end about what kind of food you want. We like to cook, and there's also a financial aspect to it, or an economic aspect, because eating out, lunch now is for two people is 60 or $70. You can't do that. You just don't want to do that every day. And so is the question, then you don't do that ever, and then you go to Lespinas, or I don't think it exists anymore, it's $800. So you sort of have to talk about. Alas, you have to talk about an answer to your question about food. I have to talk about money, and we like to cook, and that's one of the results of this. I like to cook from point of view when I was in college. So I started liking to cook, but it's we had friends of ours who were more gifted in wealth than we took Nick and me out to dinner. It was a birthday or an anniversary, and we had a spectacular meal at the Great Fish Restaurant, which name and it was every bite was superlative. God only knows what that cost. and we like to cook, and that's, we like pizza. There's a very good pizzaiolo downstairs who makes really good crust, and that's what pizza is about. It's not the toppings; it's about the crust, and makes me think of the sort of avant-garde pizzaioli in Rome who are perfecting the crust in the way that you might perfect bread making. And it is bread actually under there, a kind of bread. So and we cook. We like to cook.
Mhm. So I feel a little silly giving food recommendations to a New York native, except I've had pizza in all over Naples, Los Angeles, New York, except the best pizza maybe in the world might be Angelo's Pizza in New York, and that's not too expensive either. So it's a beautiful.
Where is Angelo's?
Angelo's in Manhattan. I'm not sure if it would be, but the crust, like you can take a pizza that's quite sort of sizable and it stays completely flat if you sort of hold it out. It's an
Right.
incredible place. But
Good to know.
also, I'm just asking this sort of personally as a junior in high school who's gonna be applying to college and choosing college soon and hopes to go to somewhere similar to where you've both attended or taught at. But what do you think of these various places that you've both attended and taught at?
Uh, a fun topic. I mean, I begin with something I say to anybody, whether it's the students or the parents, which is not very encouraging in this instance. I think there is no decision in your life that A, it would be more important that where you go to college, and B, that less about when you make the choice. I mean, it's impossible to know enough to make a good choice, and it is enormously determining on your future. And you don't know, as we say, shit from Shinola about what you're doing. I mean, I was at Horseman, and if you were in the sort of upper, which I barely was, sort of the smart kids, you by definition you wanted to go to Harvard. Um, and and it's complicated. I sort of there was a way to be early, a special way to be early admitted, and I fell short of that, and was suitably heartbroken. Um, and then because I was writing theater reviews for the Horseman newspaper, and a student from Horseman who had gone to Swarthmore and was starring in a production of King Lear, and we were doing an alumni issue of the Horseman newspaper. So my friend, who was the editor, said, "Why don't you go down there and see Arthur starring in King Lear and write a thing about him?" And I went and spent the weekend at Swarthmore, and it was, I guess, it was kind of died and gone to heaven. It just seemed everything about it, the intellectual life, those sort of late night conversations. It just seemed amazing to me. And so I did. I went to Swarthmore, and it was amazing. Um, I think, by the way, I'm surprised to learn that you're in high school. You seem much, I mean, I would never guess that you were of that age. I don't know. I think that's a compliment. I don't know.
Okay.
Um, but I do think, and I don't know how. I mean, I guess the moral of then I went to Harvard for graduate school and I hated it, and I left after a year, and, and then 30 years, and I have a job offer from Harvard, and I go to Princeton, and there's a sort of pattern there of not just that Harvard is kind of fucked up in various ways. One of my favorite PhD students of all time is now a senior professor at Harvard, not having a especially good time. But I mean, at Harvard, Harvard is a special thing. But as I say, you don't know what you're getting into. You can research, and it has an enormous bearing on you. And I think for me, just hanging out with Swarthmore students and listening to their conversation that was amazing. And that was, and it was real. I mean, that was the experience I then, I mean, they were sort of precocious, passionate, whether it was politics or art. They really wanted to talk about it into the night. That just felt, and as I say, that's exactly what it was finally when I went there. I think um, I think you have to go into it realizing just how little you know or can know, but also, as I say, how much depends on. I mean, it's not because if I'd gone to Harvard, I would have led a miserable life, but that it was so formative in ways that, of course, I couldn't have predicted. But I think it's a very, I think, go visit, you know. But even though, I watched people, tracked through Princeton, and I don't know how much they, I mean, I had the advantage that weekend of, sleeping on the floor of some Horace Mann kid who, kids who were now at Swarthmore. And I had done similar at Harvard. It wasn't particularly bad. It just wasn't incandescent in that way. But I think it's very hard. And I think um, it's going to have to do with the feel of the place and the feel of, you know, what are the students talking about? Um, what is the teaching like? I mean, how important is teaching? And that, for example, Harvard has never, including when I was offered a job there, it's never been that much. It's like everybody feels they don't need to learn anything. They're so smart, and it's worth more. Everybody was sort of discussing everything all the time, but that might not work for you. That it's not necessarily the thing everybody wants out of it. But I think having a feel about what is bringing people together, what's exciting for people, what kinds of extracurricular work are they doing in relation to what your interests are? And that, again, the other thing is, who are you? What do you want? Uh, but I think it's also, these are difficult times, and the institution of high quality elite education, is not being valued as it was when I was, at that threshold.
Mhm.
Nothing we can do about that at the moment. But I think coming to it with a certain kind of humility and saying, I'm not going to know, but what am I accepting the fact? What do I smell here? What sense do I have? And as I say, it's very hard to know. I think, and the other part, of course, you're going to make it good or bad, much more than the colleges or the university. I mean, this adds up to the fact that you as an individual have to. It's not, and that's part of the transition from high school to college. And all along as you get more advanced, is that you're in charge of your education. And the times when you just don't want your college or university to get in the way. But you have to approach it with humility and saying, I'm not going to know what is it, what does it feel like? Because the sort of speeches and the reading the catalog, it's very hard to know.
Mhm. Something interesting about Harvard that you're saying is so I email tons of professors, and this month I'm probably speaking to, I don't know, a little over 30 professors, all from top 20 universities, let's say top 15, something like that. And out of everybody I've talked to, I think I've talked to two Harvard adjacent professors, where one was at Harvard, and then another one sort of like is an expert in reserve at Harvard or something like that. Whereas especially from California, I've noticed people from Berkeley. I've like interviewed the whole Berkeley Haas School of Business, and Stanford as well is super open. But also, so you said visiting schools is very useful. I was sort of under the impression that visiting schools you can't get a great feel and it's sort of a waste of time. What do you why do you think it's?
Yeah. I think this is a problem. I think the ritual, the circuit of the visit, probably isn't. I mean, it's probably better than nothing. But the circuit of sort of the controlled official visit. I mean, it's important. If you go back to my story, I wasn't there on a college. When I went to Swarthmore, I wasn't there on a college visit. I was going to go to Harvard. I was there for a project of seeing Arthur Siegel play King Lear, and just slept on the floor of somebody's dorm room. Somebody would go to Horace Mann, and I never did the you all gather and there's a slideshow about all that crap. And I've never been in, I never was involved in admission in any of my schools really. So I don't know, but I think yes, I think the organized visit is probably, unless you have a very good sort of, nose for seeing things that aren't made obvious. The organized visit is probably not that revealing. But what else? What else is there? I think certainly uh, it's good. I came out of a private New York, a private school in New York where everybody went to college and most people went to fancy college, so to speak. um, there were 100 people in my class. 8 went to Harvard, 6 to Princeton. 3 of us went to Swarthmore from my class. Um, uh, you know, uh, Finding a way to meet and talk to people, exploring your own kind of network, family, friends. Um, and if you go visit, try to get a sense of ordinary life, not just the. I don't know how you would do that. You can't just wander into a dormitory and try to talk to people. Maybe you can. I don't know. Um, uh, yeah, the ritual visit looks to me like bullshit, pretty much. Um, Except that if you do a bunch of them, at least you have a comparison of some kind within this slightly bullshitical performance that they're putting you through. Um, and I actually did visit Harvard, and it smelled funny to me. But then I went to graduate school, and I didn't like it after all. So
So would you say students at these schools and professors just the culture is sort of consistent from school to school, whereas it's not going to be this group of students is completely different from that one, and these professors are completely different from those.
I don't. I mean, it's a case of one thing. You can't make a generalization about it. I think. Um, well, geography is, that is to say, although many of these, all the places I went had, but not everywhere I've taught, because I taught at the University of California, I taught at the University of Michigan. So, but the places I went to school had very mixed, geographically mixed people. Um, and if it doesn't, uh, that's a big difference. And I taught, when I think of my not very happy 3 years teaching at UC San Diego, which I think I undervalued the experience I was having, but I hated it. And in fact, I was getting, I mean, that was a not, I mean, I'm glad I didn't stay there for the rest of my life, but I was, when I look back, I was getting a great deal that I didn't. I mean, I was reacting to having never been on the West Coast in my life, and coming from New York to this sort of bullshit city. It isn't really a city, uh, and I went to. I drove up to Los Angeles as often as I could while I was teaching there, but I think the the sense places that don't have largely local students, probably, that's probably a good thing. It may not be, it may not mean that all of those are superior to ones that don't. I mean, there are great public institutions with high proportion of locals, but there's nothing quite um, as educational as a heterogeneous student body, and the kinds of schools with largely local, whether it's your locus or not, um, you know, that's an issue. That doesn't mean they're all inferior to, the kind of IBs or whatever. But I would certainly say how much I mean, diversity is now sort of this buzzword having to do with equality, and that's a good thing too. But sort of the true sense of how many from how many parts of the country or the world are the students. Um, I think I mean, I'm realizing this as I say it. I think I'd be very interested in that criterion. Um, uh, just when I think about UC San Diego, where I started teaching, which as I say, I didn't like it, and I left after 3 years. I think I got more than I imagined at the time, but and it's interesting that I didn't feel that at Michigan, where I taught for 4 years. I mean, that felt, but I mean, the University of Michigan is more cosmopolitan than UC San Diego, which just I think just is, as far as it's, or at least it was. I don't. These are all very out of date judgments. But I think a variety of backgrounds really is a good thing. And not just the sort of equalizing of what have been unequal opportunities in the past. That's a great thing too. But even just not having however wonderful, I never took seriously the idea of going to Columbia. I thought, been in New York my whole, although I was offered a job there eventually, but I didn't go. A sense that there are people that come from all over the place. But also, how good is the faculty? And what is and I don't know how you can judge that. I mean, you can look at these ratings. I don't, I can't imagine they're enormously dispositive. Maybe they are. I don't know. But, how good is the faculty? Who are your fellow students? These are questions that it's very difficult to get an answer to, but that's the answers you'd like to have.
Mhm. So this is a more personal question, but as a gay Jewish person in America, has that been a huge factor in your life, and how has that changed over the years?
Uh, I, I wrote a gay book and a Jewish book, so I thought about it. I oh, well, I'm very, first of all, enormously fortunate in having lived in times and places. I'm not just talking about the Holocaust now, but I mean, in times and places where that wasn't a negative, sort of by definition. And I've sworn, to be I don't know what it's like to be not a Jew in New York. They have the problem. I can hardly. I mean, part of the reason I wanted to write Berlin for Jews was, to look at another culture where obviously things were very different. But mostly that book is about the time when Berlin was, in a way, had the same kind of Jewish life as New York does before the Holocaust. But I think I have been fortunate, so, and the fact that I wrote a book about each of these completely different kind of book in the two cases, is I always tell the story. I mean, my parents who came to America as children, uh, but lived in New York, and certainly were not especially disadvantaged once they got out of Russia. Um, that they had a sense that you had to keep to yourself. That it was dangerous to be public in a way, and I'm really glad that it wasn't for me, and that I knew it was. I mean that I wasn't, as I think some people do. I wasn't creating that negative surrounding out of fear. So that I was essentially bringing the sort of anti feelings with me, and therefore sort of not being out. I'm uh, with interesting. I mean, I've written about this too. Um, at a certain point, I was out on both cases, but there were other points earlier when I wasn't out. So I've been blessed through no fault or no excellence of my own. I'm sort of, or not, I'm not having much to do with my sort of what I did. Um, but I think it's important that I, um, well, I want to interrupt myself to say that I was, at a certain point in my life, very nervous about the Jewish thing, absurdly, since I really wasn't in danger. I mean, that there's a whole, that is part of the history that you can't shed. But um, I'm thrilled to have been fortunate enough, and also to have had the fortunate enough spirit to say, I'm not I'm not hiding either of these things. There's, after all, nothing wrong with them. So why would I hide? Uh, and that if whoever you are, whoever the person across the room who thinks there's anything wrong with him, I don't, I don't want anything to do with him anyway. I'm not interested in his approval. And I remember in Oxford, and I spent at a certain point in my life a lot of time in Oxford, you know, at a dinner party, a blatantly anti-Semitic thing was said, um, and I, and it was a dinner party of lots of friends and the people I hang out with. I stood up and said, my parents told me I'd hear something like that. I didn't believe it, and thank you. I apologized to my host and said, I can't stay here now. That's not the kind of move I make. I'm definitely a go with the flow sort of. If the people around me aren't like me, I don't make a fuss about. Um, but I think I think I've been I've had a fortunate lifespan within these matters, um, and and I've uh, participated in that by writing a book in each case about something to do with that uh, part of my identity, uh, and uh, and I think that means that I have been blessed to by that identity that has given me. I know that's true. Well, both of them. That I am. That's enormous part of what I can give and what I'm proud of comes from those two identities or aspects of my identity, and how, in what crowd that meant I found myself in both instances, and often people with both of those identities. Um, and I, I've retired to New York. Uh, I grew up in Greenwich Village. I live on the Upper West Side now. Out the window, Lincoln Center nearby, um, and that but I've traveled a lot and been among people who are not like me. But it's been I sort of uh, I mean the in two different books I talk about uh, episodes in my early life when I pretended not to be Jewish, and it's been very important for me to put that out there. Uh, and it looks sort of ridiculous now. Um, like I was in the same. There was really no danger to me in New York in 1965 to admit that I was Jewish. I mean, gay is a different. These are not parallel. I mean, they sort of float in the cosmos in related ways, but they have two completely different sets of issues as far as one's identity and the presentation of it and hanging out with others who have it or don't have it or don't like it. Uh, but uh, on the whole, both of them have been, money in the bank for me is sort of what my life is like, and and who I get to hang out with and what I get to write about. And I, but I'm very lucky in that regard. I mean, it doesn't work for everybody. I mean, all the various, minority identities, um, people are going to find those who turn their back or shut their door on you. That's just the way it is. Um, I mean, am I right in assuming you have an Armenian
No,
background?
I'm Iranian, but I have
Iranian, okay.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, but I have a lot of ties to Jewish people, and 23andMe says I'm Israeli or something like that, and
I see. Who knew?
so so lots of things. And this reminds me, your story reminds me of I was talking to Ian Lustig from UPenn, and he's a political science professor.
Mm,
And his whole thing is on the Israel-Palestine conflict. And I was telling him a story about this Norwegian girl I knew who and she's like a billionaire and drives an Aston Martin as her first car. And she has Palestine tattooed on her wrist in Arabic, the white girl. But I was telling, I was telling him
great.
I was telling him about this and something that he was saying, and I had seen this in his previous work when I was researching him, except he was saying that the he was making the distinction between I forgot what he was saying, grammar and just normal
Uh,
speech.
right. I know the distinction you mean. But anyway, go ahead.
And I said the Jewish person to describe. I was doing an internship with a Jewish person, Greg Lewis, who has a real estate company here, and I was there the whole summer. It was a great experience. But he was saying that saying Jewish person, as opposed to you don't say, I don't know, Norwegian person or something like that,
Right.
is comes with a sort of anti-Semitic connotation almost that Jew has become a dirty word, he said, which is sort of an interesting point.
I I hope that's not true. And I think it's uh, what can I say? I hope that's not true. Obviously, I mean we all know why that is. That we have uh, an impossible um, regime in Israel, and but what else? What can you do about it? And we can't exactly talk about good taste in picking our leaders. God knows. Um, I don't know what to say about it. I think yeah, I'm 81 years old, and so my formational homeland is a long time ago, and we in a good way, one tries to keep the good parts of one's formation, even if the world has changed around them. Um, as I talk about in, I think more than one book, certainly in the book called Berlin for Jews, I talk about the openly about a period in my life when I pretended not to be Jewish. I have the sort of story I tell about that. And you know, I give that out. I don't keep it a secret. And it's very, I think, uh, I think each time I've talked about it in the book, it's in the first few pages. When it's sort of, if that's going to bother you, fine. And I obviously, it's also kind of comical because I don't think this, I don't know how many people I actually convinced of this lie. Um, but yeah, I don't. I'm sorry that we are so uh, bordered by these kind of ethnic categories. I mean, that's the problem. I mean, you can decide at a given moment which of them are, people are proud of and which of them they're ashamed of and all that. But it would be better, especially, I mean, if we have the luxury, as we do for the moment in this country, uh, so that the identifying oneself with a group is not likely to be dangerous to you, then I think it's great to identify yourself. And I'm sorry. In my second, my Horace Mann education, which was absolutely fundamental. More, as usual, the earlier the education, the more important it is. But it was surely 90% Jewish boys. Uh, and I always say I think there were more African Americans than white non-Jews, which, considering we're talking about a long time ago, is and that was that was not a good, that sort of homogeneity. It felt safe in a way, but I mean I didn't feel unsafe in the rest of the world. In New York, big deal. But it's one of the things, again, to go back to going to college. Unless you go to the local school down the block, it is tremendous. Part of it is that you'll get to know and like and be friends with and go to bed with, whatever, people who are different from where you are. And I think that, I mean, I don't know what do you live in the suburbs?
No, I live in Houston, the city.
You live in
In Houston proper, like very much in there.
Good. I approve of that. But the sort of diversity, and not just the politically weighted thing, which has to do with black and white, but all the diversities are really a great thing. And that's the only, I mean, when I think about Horace Mann, I think it's incredible that I had such a good fortune and that my parents were not rich, paid for it. And I'm not sure exactly why I mean, anyway, they did. But it was very important to enter into a more diverse gene pool at Swarthmore, which wasn't that diverse either. But compared to upper middle class New York Jewish, ostensibly wasn't a religious school, it wasn't a Jewish school, but everybody was Jewish, and that getting the sort of moment when you, again, back to the choice, the moment when you realize you've landed as a freshman in college, you really want to feel, wow, I'm meeting people I would never have met, I would never have met before this. And that is almost inevitable, and unless you're sent to sort of New England prep school kind of thing, which are not at all diverse, of course, but that the business of going away to school, I put a high, check mark on that blanket. Obviously, if you are admitted to a far superior place in your home, that's fine. But going away to school is big, big plus in my opinion.
That's interesting you say that because obviously Houston itself is very diverse, except I go to
Right.
an international school and I'm getting the IB degree, and we have an international festival, and for Diwali there was a huge sort of celebration, and there's
Right.
people who speak all kinds of languages. We had to learn three languages at the start, so it's interesting that you
Wonderful.
say that's important.
Languages that, and we didn't talk about that. That's the where the money is. I mean, not the money, actually. That's where the hell with the money. Um, Languages. There's so, I mean, everything good, not everything, but much of the good in my life has come to me because I had exposure to multiple languages. I was good at language. I mean, I remember the first time somehow didn't happen with French, it happened with German. Um, I was, in fact, going to a summer French language thing, but they had a French and a German, we were on the same airplane. So we landed in Frankfurt, and then those of us who were going on to France, went the next day. But for a day, I was in Frankfurt, and I had studied German for a very long time. And that first sort of thrill that I actually could talk to people, and the people I was with, they were all students of French. They couldn't talk to me. And I was the one who was studying French but knew German. Um, and that all of a sudden, I talked to people on the street in their language. Even though I grew up in New York, where God knows, you can hear 500 languages in the course of an afternoon, but that it wasn't a special deal to be talking German. It was because everyone was talking German, and I could talk to them, and so my goodness, this 5 years spent learning German, hey, I have a skill. And so I think languages, they bring with them, in my life, everything that's important is sort of trails along in that thread that begins with, how do you say hello, goodbye, thank you, in, and I've never, more or less, never gone anywhere except Budapest, where nobody can learn that language. Uh, I've never gone anywhere where, well, I've gone. I mean, I don't really know Spanish. I've been to Spain, but basically, until recently, I'd never gone anywhere where I couldn't speak the language. And of course, I have French and German and Italian, and as far as Western Europe is concerned, that's okay. But but learning language, getting good at learning languages, getting the chance to use them for real and not just in the class, going for a summer to a place where they speak it, and talking to your contemporaries who are not only speaking that language but have many other things to share with you. Nothing better than that.
Mhm. That's very interesting. So I was in language. I haven't been so good at learning languages, except it's been definitely a huge part of my schooling. And I was turning in this is a complete side note, but I was turning in some document for an application, and I had a 78 in Spanish in eighth grade. For some reason that was on there, but then like 97 in math, something like that. So it was sort of skewed, but sort of skewed. But
Right.
so my experience with languages, I've obviously learned English because I was born in Houston, except I also spoke Farsi because my mom uh,
Right.
moved here sort of late, and then Farsi and Dowry, which is sort of a Farsi-esque language in Afghanistan. That's just sort of I picked up as well, just
Wonderful.
online. But then I also learned Spanish in school, and then I learned some Chinese for I don't know, maybe 5 years, something like that. But I'm not too good at Chinese. But with Spanish, all these languages I was not a big fan of. And Farsi, obviously, I spoke Farsi with natives, but they were just family members. That was a second nature to me. Except, and I travel quite a bit with my family, except whenever we travel, it's sort of, it's not like I'm getting a huge feel for the culture because we're at hotels or nice restaurants. We're not really in the roots.
Yeah.
Last year with the school, I went to Peru for 2 weeks.
Uh-huh.
Peru, we really went to the villages and we got down and dirty with the people, and it was super cool speaking. Obviously, some people spoke Quechua, which is a language native to Peru.
Right.
Except the vast majority of people spoke Spanish, and speaking Spanish, and we had homestay, things like that. Speaking Spanish with native people
Right.
was an incredible experience and something
Right.
I've never experienced at all.
And I remember the first time that was that Frankfurt landing in Frankfurt in 1961 or whatever it was, and we were and I had studied German at Horstman, and as I say, everybody else in the group was learning French, and nobody knew German. But then just they really speak it. It's real. It's not conjugating verbs and whatever the beginning. And that I think I never got over it. I mean, let us say that thrill stayed with me. And Italian, I've never. I mean, Italian was just by far my best foreign language because I really lived there a lot, and I and most importantly, in those days, no Italians didn't know any other languages. They certainly didn't know English. Maybe the most educated knew French. So and I didn't know anybody, and I by the end of the year, I was dreaming in Italian. I mean, it just that acculturation, which I glimpsed with German in Frankfurt in 1962, and then 25 years later, I experienced in Italian, which I had never studied, and that's still. I mean, Italian is my most comfortable foreign language, even though we live part of the year in Berlin, where everyone speaks English, unfortunately. But that again, it looks like a mechanical thing to conjugate verbs and all that. It's the fundamental thing that will allow you to not belong, allow you a place in another culture. Or if you don't have it, you will not have a place. I mean, that's sort of a given. And it's great that you've had whatever family related non-English you've had. I mean, my parents spoke Yiddish, and I understood it perfectly, and I'm sure it helped enormously with learning German. Um, Basically, Yiddish is sort of medieval German. But the thrill of it's normal. This is not I'm not conjugating verbs now. I'm saying, where's the nearest toilet? Or, how do I find a doctor? Or where's the museum? Whatever it is. And I remember being in Budapest where, nobody could learn Hungarian. It was Hungarian. And, there was obviously people spoke German and English and so on. But the sense of, Nick and I were on a bus, and at a certain point the bus stopped, and there was a long, long announcement in Hungarian, and half the people on the bus got out. Who knew? I mean, luckily it wasn't everybody. We stayed. Sort of on the theory that the less you do, the better. But that sense that this. I mean, it wasn't that the bus was going to blow up. It was clearly there was a detour. Who knew? I mean, Hungarian has no there's nothing you can do with it. No entry is possible from knowing 4 other languages. But that Nick and I looked at each other. We stayed on the bus. It was all right. We're here. But that's the thrill of just being comfortable in a foreign place, which I think is impossible if you don't have the language. I mean, there are foreign places that are so Anglified. Then Berlin might be said to be one of them. But it's really, there's nothing nothing quite like being able to talk to people in their own language.
Mhm. And something I found that's very unique that you don't necessarily get with superficial interactions in another language, but when somebody tries to speak sort of broken English with you and they're not really getting a message across, and then all of a sudden you start speaking in Spanish in this case, and all you see a totally new personality, totally new person.
Absolutely.
It's like going into an alien world and understanding and
Right.
a whole new lens.
Right.
But lastly, we ask all of our interviewees the same question, which is how do you define success personally and professionally?
Well, getting to professionally, getting to do what you like to do, and and making a living or whatever. I mean, being able to live with work you like to do, and I think that's um, uh, that's the business. And I think any of us, and I would imagine you included, any of us who have the privilege of caring parents and good education. That's where you want to go with all this. Is um, having uh, work that is gratifying to you, and that's um, the success is that you like your work. I mean, there's your whole personal life is another dimension, but not one that, I mean, you can't take classes in it. Uh, Although I think I sort of, um, I don't think from the time, certainly by the time I was at Horace Mann, I mean, I very early on understood that I'd probably be a teacher, college, whatever. I mean, roughly, and insofar as I understood what it was that I would do for a living what I enjoy doing, and I do. Um, but that certainly success is that you like your job. That that's an important, and that you communicate. Can you communicate with the people around you? Obviously, that you're lucky enough to have a personal life that's satisfying. I'm gay. That's another hurdle as far as along with the Jew thing is the gay thing, and that whatever one's background or status, majority minority, that opens the door rather than shutting doors. And I think learning languages is way up there with those, quite apart from travel or profession. Just that it comes with a sense that not everybody is like me, and I think that, I mean, you have immigrant parents. I had immigrant parents, so um, that's from the get go. That there's more than one way to be in this world, more than one language to speak, more than one mentality, so forth. And I think that's a great blessing. Um, uh, and especially if you expand that beyond that particular other, so you're interested in other others than the one you grew up in. So I think that, and that is that's something that it's nice that it's confirmed by your formal education, but it comes from, it doesn't, it starts at home. And as I say, do do you speak Farsi? I mean,
Yeah, I
are
speak
you
Farsi, yeah.
fluent Farsi? That's wonderful. Um, well, it's a great civilization,
Mm.
and that's an honor that you know it.